Remember this guy? Whether those memories are fair or foul, one thing can be said. Ross Perot shook things up. He brought a new voice to the political scene. Some say he siphoned votes off from the Republicans, giving the Democrats a clear victory in the election of '92. He was a spoiler. But was he just a spoiler, or did he challenge the very political order?
Spoiler is a word, it's a derogatory word that is used in the political field to describe a group of people who are voting for a candidate that you don't want them to vote for. They say you're spoiling it. And so if you run a third-party candidate who's not affiliated with either of the major parties, you would pull votes away from the man that would be the lesser of two evils, and therefore that would throw the election to the man who is the greater of two evils, and therefore you are the spoiler because you voted for a man of principle.
We are spending the next generation's money right now in our country. We're $4 trillion in debt. We're going $400 billion into debt this year. It is very important that my generation fix this and leave the American dream intact.
Regardless of how you view this period, the Democrats and Republicans made sure a Ross Perot would never happen again. And it never has.
It's been a very long time since you've had a national third party. And what happens when you have one that's successful, like Perot, one or the other party will tend to co-opt the best issues of the Populist Party and take it over.
No third-party candidate has even come close to standing upon that presidential debate stage with a new vision. Ever wonder how the entrenched parties have accomplished this?
Well, I believe you could say that essentially all of the Founding Fathers viewed political parties with suspicion. In those days, in fact, they tended to look at what we call political parties or political movements of that type as factions. James Madison wrote, in fact, an entire number 10 of the Federalist Papers, dealing with the danger of factions.
Madison felt that the larger the republic, the more factions would exist within it and would keep each other in check by their diversity. Diversity would essentially cancel out the dangers of large factions emerging that would promote their own self-interest at the expense of everyone else.
What are the Democrats and the Republicans doing with this nation? Are they the spoilers? How have these groups been able to monopolize power?
For the past 50 years now, the Democrats and Republicans have been moving steadily toward gaining a monopolistic control over the American political system. And the way they do this is by controlling the national TV presidential debates. They exclude all competition to their big government vision. They disallow all third political parties. Well, if a third party cannot get into those debates, it can never achieve the stature and the credibility in the voters' eyes. So this is how the Democrats and Republicans have monopolized the system.
Third parties, by nature, do not have a platform on the national level. And this is directly due to the influence of the two major parties.
Most Americans have resigned themselves to the idea that they will have either a Democrat or Republican in the White House. Every 4 years, the frenzied call for change emanates from the citizenry. Often we flip to the Democrats because those darn Republicans are messing everything up. And then 4 years to 8 years later, we flop back to the Republicans because the darn Democrats aren't doing any better.
Mostly to blame is the Democratic Party and unions.
Republicans have gone over to the far other side of the right wing, influenced by the Tea Party, no doubt.
Prior to the election, they differentiate themselves. After the election, they're pretty much the same.
The disappointment is that people don't hold to the idea that their word is their bond, that if you say something, you become morally obliged to fulfill it. All sorts of promises, changes for the better, sometimes just change and not even define. They're saying anything but this, we want change.
Each major party promises change, promises smaller government, promises more efficient government. Nevertheless, the government does not become more efficient, and it does not become smaller. Instead, it grows larger and larger, consuming ever greater shares of GDP, ever greater shares of our productivity, while demanding even more taxes to pay for it all.
Pocketbook issues drive elections. People are doing well. They don't care if there's corruption in the government, if they're feeling financial pain. The opportunity is there for a third party to come in and supplant either the Republicans or the Democrats.
The Democrats and Republicans make ever more promises in order to get elected. Ever more privileges, ever more subsidies, ever more programs, ever more welfare are handed out, and the citizens continue to vote for whoever will deliver. Eventually, the citizens feel entitled to all these privileges. Thus, a new word, entitlements, enters the lexicon.
Well, when any country or government tries to pass out endless subsidies and handouts to its people, it goes bankrupt and usually collapses into some form of a dictatorship shortly thereafter. You're going to see things get much worse in the future if we don't change political directions today. You're going to see more and more oppressive taxes. You're going to see more and more inflationary booms and busts, perhaps even a catastrophic economic collapse, more government regimentation and regulation of our lives. Any country that tries to pass out endless subsidies and welfare and entitlements to its people must self-destruct.
Eventually, citizens feel they are not just entitled to privileges, that privileges are a right. Thus, new rights enter the lexicon. Rights that are in clear conflict with the very Constitution that gave birth to the U.S. Republic.
The concept of welfare has within it the implication of charity. We're doing this because we want to do it, because we're good people, because we have a big heart and we care about people. That's the welfare concept. The other concept, entitlements, has the ring of right to it. We have a right to this. We have a right to a job. We have a right to free medical care. We have a right to housing. We have a right to a decent diet. It's our right. It's though it's written into the Constitution. So it's more of an attitude of justification. Why are we doing this? One is because we're doing it to be charitable, but it adds up to the same thing. It's the transfer of wealth from one group of people to another. And generally, the people who are receiving the transfer are the ones that are more politically powerful.
Before long, taxes aren't enough to pay for all the privileges, entitlements, and new rights. The government must start printing money. And it does, courtesy of the Federal Reserve System and the elite bankers who have been granted the special privilege of counterfeiting money.
I consider the Federal Reserve Act and the creation of the Federal Reserve as being unconstitutional. It gave the government then the power to create legal tender out of thin air, that is, to create paper money. And although they didn't do that overnight, between 1913 and 1971, that is exactly what happened. And I think subtly, they sort of like it. You know, they like it because, you know, I don't have to raise taxes and somehow or another these bills get paid. Not understanding that when you dilute the value of money, it's really an immoral, deceitful tax on the people. But it will come to an end. If you study monetary history throughout thousands of years, you will find out that paper money has been tried many, many times and it never succeeds. It always ends badly.
And as the printing and taxing escalates, the value of the dollar goes down and the productivity of the citizens is suppressed by an ever-increasing burden of debt and loss of purchasing power. The U.S. citizens become strapped to a European-style treadmill in order to pay for all the privileges they feel they are entitled to.
They get into a treadmill because everything that they produce from the sweat of their brow and the creativity of their minds and hands, that's all taken away from them by a collectivist system. No matter how hard they run, they don't get anywhere because all the surplus of their labor is taken away from them. So that leads to despair. And they think, what's the point of trying? What's the point of putting in that little extra effort? I'm not going to gain by it anyway. And this is the core, I believe, of the failure of all collectivist systems. They kind of just run down.
And many Americans are trying to get us on a European treadmill that will keep us running harder and harder to pay more and more taxes for more and more benefits, many of which we really don't need. Personal freedom means that we have the ability to say, what do I want to do with my own income? And that's why a smaller government, A more restrictive taxation scale is the ideal for many who understand the history of how taxation ultimately takes away freedom.
All this continues no matter which political party is in power. It continues because those who work in government benefit. They benefit because they get to be the middleman in the gargantuan welfare state we're collectively creating. Like government, middlemen don't add value, they just collect fees between buyers and sellers, between consumers and producers. In short, they are administrative parasites. The U.S. government, in order to provide entitlements that certain people demand, is now little more than a multi-trillion-dollar parasite on an otherwise free market economy.
Well, the free market is the economic system of free people, and it's important because first, it's consistent with human freedom, and secondly, it is the most efficient and effective distributor of goods that is known to man. And third, inevitably, where there isn't genuine free market of a moral people and a virtuous people, it results in a rising prosperity for all.
Generally, the federal government is not a good operator of businesses, actually a very lousy operator of businesses. You look at Amtrak, the post office, and such as examples. As a result, generally the less involvement there is by the federal government and the private enterprise sector, the better.
Though the Democrats and Republicans promise change, the parasite never goes away. It only gets bigger. Nothing changes. We continue our relentless march from the limited republic envisioned by the founders to the global monstrosity we now have threatening every corner of the planet.
Limited government is absolutely essential, and the Founding Fathers were very impressed with that idea. The opposite of limited government, of course, is total government. You can call it what you want. You can call it totalitarianism, you can call it dictatorship, you can call it vicious monarchy or whatever. And so the Founding Fathers of our country didn't want the government to be able to do whatever it wanted. They wanted strictly defined powers, and that's what they gave us in the Constitution.
The Founding Fathers had looked particularly to history. They were great historians of political movements and political structures. And that was their one fear. They said, well, every one of these systems that didn't have built into it a system of checks and balances eventually deteriorated into some kind of tyranny.
No matter which party is in power, nothing seems to spoil the relentless expansion of government. The welfare warfare state continues to grow. The statist agenda continues to spoil the republic Ben Franklin and the founders established.
Well, what we mean by the statist agenda is big government, big nanny state, welfare state, centralized government from Washington, a government from the top down, a government that intervenes into our lives in a dominant way, regulates and regiments the prices and wages, manipulates the interest rates in the banking system, excessively expands the money supply, creates inflationary booms and busts. It tells us when to retire and how to retire. It mandates that we subscribe to certain medical programs. It basically intervenes in every nook and cranny of our existence.
Fair or not? Now that's a government intervention. Frankly, I'm not afraid of being exposed for doing that.
The astute citizen will recall that Ross Perot warned us of much of this. But what did some do with this wise third-party advice? They made fun of his charts and haircut. They said Perot will spoil George Bush's chance of getting elected. They said he'll preempt conservative votes and get Bill Clinton elected. And Bill did get elected, but would the Republicans have governed any differently? Clinton expanded the bureaucracies of Washington, gutted the U.S. manufacturing base with NAFTA, opened the borders to illegals, and undermined American sovereignty with such things as PD Directive 25. But the Republican George W. Bush did exactly the same. In fact, most would say that the younger Bush and now Obama have expanded the oppressiveness of government even worse.
Pulled her over for driving while on her cell phone and also for speeding. She refuted the allegation. She stepped out of her minivan and he tasered her while her 2 children sat in the car.
So what did Ross Perot really spoil compared to Bill Clinton, George Bush, and Barack Obama? Ross warned us that American jobs would go south and beyond, that NAFTA would destroy the middle class, that debt would overwhelm us. Both Clinton and Bush promoted NAFTA and the globalist agenda in defiance of the middle class, and debt has since overwhelmed us. Ross warned us of the Flint, Michigans and Roger Smiths that would come, but who listened? Ross Perot was spoiling the multinationals' party.
The argument that's always made by people against third-party involvement, alternative party involvement is, well, you're simply going to be a spoiler because you'll have this effect. But of course that isn't true in the long run, because if you look, I think the Democratic Party probably in this country does go very far back. Republican Party started when, 1850s. So the Republican Party initially was a spoiler party, if you will. So it really depends on events whether a party or a political movement will turn out to be a spoiler as opposed to being successful.
The term spoiler, I think it's overplayed.
Thus, no matter which party is in power, American citizens end up paying the bill. They always get the short end of the stick, whether it's higher taxes or fewer jobs, less purchasing power or more regulations. We, the people, are getting screwed. Who benefits? Always the middleman, the state. Even though the philosophy put forward by statists is that all these entitlements are for the greater good.
There are people who see themselves as not winners and who see themselves as being able to benefit from political action and government favoritism, and they support candidates who will basically favor their industries or their cause. And the politicians who do that are benefited by those individuals at election time by votes and money. So what you have is a growing system of entitlements for various constituencies given to them by politicians in return for their votes. It's a trade-off of economic benefit for one and power for the other.
The power groups and ignorant citizens that keep the Democrats and Republicans in power do so in order to maintain the status quo of the welfare state. No matter which decade, each entrenched party promises change, yet delivers more and more special privileges.
Special privileges violate individual rights in numerous ways. Let's say the government wants to convey the privilege of a subsidy to a corporation or to a farmer or a low-income earner. It has to first confiscate that money from the productive citizen. And in the process of the confiscation, it violates his rights to his property, which is what his income is. And it also violates his rights to equality under the law because it has to use a progressive rate tax system to do that. The government also has to violate rights when it conveys an affirmative action quota to a minority group. It has to violate the majority's rights to their freedom of association. It also violates the consumer's right to trade freely when it conveys a price support system to, let's say, the oil companies. Provides a floor under which the oil prices will not go. It violates the consumer's rights to trade freely. So just about every government intervention into the economy, it has to violate the rights of someone somewhere.
And with such handouts come regulations and more state oppression. This modus operandi is in direct conflict with the vision of the Founding Fathers.
I mean, that's the number of papers they added just last year. This pile of regulations, more than 80,000 pages, is just what the federal government imposed on us. States and towns added even more.
The Constitution of the United States was never intended to provide privileges, but to protect its citizens. It wasn't until 80 or 100 years later when the concept of collectivism began to infect the American shores. It came over from Europe, came from France, came from Germany, the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And it sort of began to seep into the American political scene little by little, so that today most Americans are thinking first not about being protected by their government, but being taken care of by their government.
The vision upon which the U.S. was established is a vision that the government is there to protect liberty, not provide privileges.
What is happening is a free, democratic, self-reliant people are being converted basically into children of the state.
Government is supposed to be large enough to provide those necessities the free market cannot, and protect our liberty, property, and lives. Somewhere in the past 100 years, we have gone off the rails. The philosophic views held by most Americans today have changed, given they tolerate such a government.
Philosophy asks all the big questions of our existence. The philosophers ask questions like, what is truth? What is justice? What is a proper political system? And what is proper interaction of human beings in society? What questions philosophers ask and how they answer them largely affects what kind of cultures and what kind of political systems will evolve in the ensuing decades and centuries. The American Republic did not just spring full-blown in 1776. It had its origins 100 years prior with John Locke. His contractual theories of government, his ideas on individualism, these all laid the philosophical groundwork for 100 years later when Jefferson and the founders launched the American Republic and wrote the Constitution, and these ideas also laid the groundwork for the culture of the 19th century.
We have gone from a nation that has replaced love with tolerance and strong individuals with dependent weaklings. We've gone from a nation of people that forged quality products in the competition of a free market to a nation of people increasingly reliant on government handouts and imports. We have gone from a free market capitalist nation to a nanny state, a nation of people who acknowledged God-given rights, to a nation of people obsessed with state-doled privileges.
Certain things that people strive for and need to live by are gifts from God, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of real ultimate happiness, the right to property. These ideas our founders said were not given by a government. They are what we possess by simply being alive in God's world. And so our founders called them inalienable rights. Alienable means they come from another. Inalien means I can't give away my rights. No one can give them to me. I simply have them because I am a person in God's world, in God's image. There's never been a more extraordinary basis for law ever conceived in the entire world than this. I think Ronald Reagan captured it quite well when he put it this way. A government that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you have.
Over the past 234 years of our nation's existence, we have operated upon two distinct philosophic principles. In the first 137-year era, we operated upon principles that can be summarized by the following words: independence, liberty, competition, free enterprise, capitalism, individual rights, laissez-faire government, non-interventionist foreign policy, gold-backed monetary system, lower taxes, little to no debt, and limited government.
The first 137 years of our country's existence would be described as steady progress. So much so that millions of people left the old world and came here penniless, not for government benefits, not to be taken care of, for an opportunity to succeed. The upward mobility of America was dramatic. It still exists to some degree, but not as much as it did during the period to the year 1913 when things began to change.
In the last 97-year era, we operated upon principles that can be summarized by the following words: interdependence, license, regulation, monopoly capitalism, socialism, entitlements, unrequited foreign aid, nation building, fiat currency, legal tender laws, taxes on every transaction, debilitating debt, loss of purchasing power, and gargantuan government.
The years that run there up to the Coolidge administration and through it, I think are years of America as an independent and free republic with a very small national government and limited government at the state level. And since then, I think government has become the dominant force in American life. It has become the controller of the economy. Government at the local, state, and federal level consume as much of America's wealth as they did at the height of World War II. I think that is growing inexorably, and I think that's what eventually leads to the fall of democracies and the fall of republics.
You have to realize that there was a fellow back in 1848 who wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto. And the famous Communist Manifesto has 10 planks. Plank number 2 is an income tax. Plank number 5 is a Federal Reserve. Plank number 10 is free education for all children in government schools. Why did Marx want all the children in the government schools? To have them indoctrinated. Why did he want a Federal Reserve? He wanted that because control the nation's economic system, you control the nation. The 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, every single one of them is partially or fully in place in the United States today, and it all happened in the 20th century.
History has shown that the only way millions of people can be led into misfortune or doom is by their intellectuals, their thinkers, their philosophers. The reason this is so is because almost all categories of human knowledge ultimately descend from philosophy.
One of the central questions of political philosophy was concerned with the divine right of kings, because the king claimed that he was a god or an instrument of God, and you better do what the king says, and that's basically it. And they came to the conclusion after much thought that the king was not a god. He's just a man. He forms his power through knowable processes, and this usually involves gathering a gang of followers around himself in which he rewards them with gifts and privileges and honors and bestows rights upon them and land, and generally keeps them in line by giving them cookies.
Values and religion are based upon philosophy, culture is based upon philosophy, politics is based upon philosophy. Even science is based upon philosophy, for the scientific method itself is but a philosophical theory that began with the Greek philosopher Aristotle, came to fruition with the brilliance of Galileo and Francis Bacon, but then was distorted by the positivism of the French philosopher Auguste Comte in the mid-19th century.
The great truth that we began with as America was born was both political and spiritual. The political one was, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All of us can see that they're true. Where did they get these self-evident truths? Well, they were operating with the world that there was a right and a wrong that was established by a creator who'd revealed himself in nature and in Scripture.
When I think of the writings of the great thinkers that I have had a chance to read, I'm never impressed by what they said about money or about politics in terms of the mechanics of politics. What I'm most impressed about is what they say about human relationships, the concepts that people should follow when they're dealing with each other and setting up social systems. What is the just system? Not what is the most profitable system, but what is the system under which people can find their maximum fulfillment of whatever it is they want to be or do in their life? What is the system that gives them the maximum amount of personal freedom without interfering with the freedom of others? These are, I think, the issues that the great minds of history have turned to.
Yet the masses are usually unaware of this procession of thought, for they are busy with the day-to-day fight, the current election, the vicissitudes of existence. Ironically, an existence they must bear because of the particular philosophy they have chained their lives to.
Saturday night ribeye could be tough. If USDA meat inspectors get furloughed, which hasn't been decided yet, beef will go on.
Even though not everyone knows it, everyone has a philosophy. The word philosophy means what you believe about ultimate reality, how you determine what is true. But the problem is that philosophers and philosophies can be diametrically opposed. Karl Marx had a philosophy. It's called Marxism. Marx says there is no God. And there is a hope, but it's not in the world to come. It's in the world we create. That kind of Marxism, cultural Marxism or dialectical materialism, real full-blown communism, is an attempt to destroy and eradicate philosophies like Christianity. And so philosophy is constantly at war. Whose philosophy will ultimately prevail?
But what does any of this have to do with the Democrats or Republicans? Surely these two political parties represent entirely different political philosophies. Surely one is the right way and the other is the wrong way. Surely we have a choice. Before answering this question, let's take a look at a concept many Americans have never considered in detail, what's known as the political spectrum.
If you entrust me with the presidency.
When people discuss a political spectrum, usually they're talking about a continuum from one end to the other of some kind. Typically, it's the continuum from left to right. And they say that, well, at one end of the political spectrum, we've got the extreme left, and on the other end, we've had the extreme right.
So, when you were in school or college, you learned that liberals are on the left and conservatives are on the right. You further learned that the Democrats are liberals and the Republicans are conservatives. Later in life, you began to realize what philosophical values Democrats were supposed to have and what philosophical values Republicans were supposed to have. This accomplished, you were now in a position to fight for one side of the political spectrum or the other every election.
A progressive is someone who wants to find truth in the future. A conservative is someone who believes that truth is already known and that it can develop, but the truth known must not be discarded as one pursues new ideas.
On the surface, both choices sound great. No wonder Americans campaign so vigorously for the Democrats or the Republicans every election year. No wonder America is so dynamic and free. Or is it?
The Democratic and Republican parties have been, for some time now, two wings of the same bird of prey. They both have battened on federal programs and transfers of wealth and power to various corporations and institutions and individuals. And neither, I think, has really been the conservative party that both of them were in the 19th century in a way.
What do you think of the Democrat and Republican parties?
I'm going to pass, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, not a member of either.
All right.
I don't.
Yeah. Makes no difference which political party is in power. The major objectives continue to be the same. We continue to support the banking system. We continue to support a fiat money system. We don't question the power of the banking cartel called the Federal Reserve System. We continue to turn our sovereignty over to international agencies. We're doing our best to get rid of American currency, to establish a global currency. We're creating a North American Union to merge the United States with Mexico and Canada. These are the big issues, and they're not even discussed.
The two parties are very close together. We should have other alternatives. We're allowed to have them, but the rules are so biased you can't get on ballots and you can't get in debates. And so therefore you're excluded unless you're a billionaire.
Both parties always push to expand government so that it can assist their agenda. Oh, the Republicans promise to reduce government, but once in office, they do just what the Democrats do. As Stanton Evans once observed, conservatives come to Washington knowing it's a sewer, but they always end up treating it like a hot tub.
Once they go to Washington, like I said, they get into somebody's pocket.
They always cross over the aisle and join with the Democrats and hop into that hot tub and start passing out the pork and privilege. And the reason why they do this is because our tax system in America is terribly warped. The progressive rate tax system allows for 50% of the American voters to pay zero taxes or next to zero taxes. And this allows them to get their government services for free or next to free. And this has created what is called, in economic jargon, infinite demand for government services. This is basic human nature. It's a cardinal law of economics. If government benefits are free or nearly free, demand for them will be infinite.
Thus, by design or circumstance, the two political parties end up producing the same results: the expansion of the state. And this expansion is caused and justified by the misguided philosophy that social programs and regulation provide benefits to society with no downside.
At the end of the day, both parties, Democrat and Republican, strive toward authoritarian rule over the government of the people in the same way monarchs and their gaggle of devout followers strive to control the people of their kingdoms. Same for military dictatorships and autocrats, and for ayatollahs issuing fatwas to the people from their theocratic ivory towers. Both Democrats and Republicans are trying to do exactly the same thing: establish themselves as the supreme authoritarians over government of the people.
We have been indoctrinated by the ideas of certain prominent philosophers over the past 200 years, the three most important being Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his idea that the general will of society must be absolute in determining what government is to do; Auguste Comte and his idea that man's highest moral purpose is to altruistically sacrifice himself for humanity; and Karl Marx and his idea that the workers of the world should unite against capitalism. All three of these ideas are false, yet they are subscribed to subconsciously by both Democrats and Republicans today.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the 18th century French philosopher, his chief corrupting idea would be his general will theory, in which he maintained that the general will of society must be absolute in determining what kind of a political system we are to have. So this conflicts directly with what the Founding Fathers advocated. They certainly did not want a democracy. They wanted a limited constitutional government, and they certainly did not want an absolute democracy. Auguste Comte was another French philosopher, mid-19th century. His chief corrupting idea would have to be altruism, in which he maintained that man's highest moral purpose is to always sacrifice his interests and his rights to humanity, or to the group, or to the collective. This was perverted by the politicians into meaning the state or the government. And naturally, this was music to the ears of all the collectivist mentalities. They could then morally intimidate all the voters into sacrificing their interest and rights to the government and the state. Karl Marx's chief corrupting idea would have to be his capitalist exploitation theories, in which he maintained that capitalism as a system would grind the workers down to starvation wages. Well, any student of economic history can surely see that capitalism does not grind the workers down to starvation wages. In fact, it does just the opposite. It elevates everyone's real wages higher and higher as each decade goes by.
So, here's how you've been screwed by philosophy, that innocent, boring subject that only little old men with beards practice in ivory towers.
Philosophy is extremely important. Nowadays, higher education, for example, has turned out generations of young people that have repudiated the quote-unquote antiquated ideas of our founding fathers and religion and God and the Bible and Christianity, and now we're enlightened and we're progressive, and basically what that means is we've adopted Marxist/socialist/fascist ideology, and we've repudiated the fundamental ideology upon which America was founded. And that's the dichotomy that's going on in America today.
Remember we said earlier that the United States has undergone two vast philosophical eras? Well, let's name those eras. The first era could be called the Libertarian Conservative Era, or Conservative Era for short, and the second could be called the Progressive Era.
Well, what we mean by the progressive era is that period of history in America between 1913 and up to the present day. It started at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was launched by a group of intellectuals that called themselves progressives. Now, they were largely socialist and collectivist in their worldview, but they knew that it would be a tough sell to get socialism across to the American people, so they changed its name and started calling it progressivism. The progressives have increased government every decade throughout the 20th century. This is what progressivism is: big interventionist government at an increasing level every decade.
We can really see a shift that occurred at the bicentennial celebration of Washington's birth. That's in the early 1900s, 1930.
Wait a minute, the progressive era?
The progressive era.
Who would have guessed that? That's weird, okay.
In other words, a devout, evangelical, Christian founding father didn't play well for those that wanted to move beyond Christian influence in government, and Western civilization.
It could be said the conservative era began with George Washington and ended in 1913 when the Federal Reserve System was established.
But unfortunately, the system came to an end in 1913 with the inception of the Federal Reserve banking system and the federal progressive rate tax system. These two institutions allowed the government to grow exponentially in our lives and basically undo almost everything that the libertarian conservative era had done.
The country we live in today is another country compared to the one our parents grew up in the 1920s and 1930s.
During the conservative era, inflation, as measured by the CPI, decreased by 42%. But during the progressive era, it has risen in an aggregate of 1,850% and is still rising.
Going back actually to the founding of the American colonies, over that period of almost 300 years, there was virtually no inflation. I mean, you'd go up and down, but the prices back in the 1660s were generally about the same as they were in 1910. Once the Fed came in and they started changing the system, using that as a base point, the dollar has lost 98% of its value, of its purchasing power. Roosevelt took it one step further when he abandoned the gold standard in 1933, introduced a fiat currency. Richard Nixon took the final step, closing the gold window and the ability to settle international accounts in gold. And since then, the dollar has rapidly depreciated. Inflation has soared, and the government has changed the way it reports the consumer price index, with the effect of putting a downside bias into inflation.
During the conservative era, the United States had a true annual growth rate of about 4%. During the progressive era, the growth rate is claimed to be 4%, but this is an illusory figure. It's illusory because this growth rate is a result of an inflated money supply and because the government has manipulated the GDP figures over the years.
Fiat currency allows the government to obtain purchasing power without taxation. If the government can print money itself directly out of the Treasury or indirectly through some kind of banking system, it obviously does not have to go to the taxpayers or to people lending money to it in the open market in order to obtain the money that it needs for spending. Well, this allows the politicians then to spend really more than the general public would accept in terms of paying for it. But taxes are in fact imposed through the inflationary mechanism. They're just surreptitiously imposed.
In other words, the dollar emitted by the Federal Reserve System has lost over 95% of its purchasing power.
The Consumer Price Index, as it was first popularly used in auto union contracts, was designed as a measure of cost of living needed to maintain a constant standard of living. It would measure the cost of a fixed basket of goods For example, they take the price of a pound of steak, a gallon of milk, a gallon of gasoline. They then measure those same items the next year, and whatever the package had gone up by, that was the rate of inflation that you hopefully would meet with a salary increase or wage increase, or in a return on your investments that would enable you to live that year at least as well as you did the year before. Come the early 1990s, late 1980s, Alan Greenspan, and it was then Fed chairman, started talking about how the consumer price index overstated inflation. You ask them, well, how does it overstate inflation? Your answer would be, well, if the price of steak gets too high, people will buy more hamburger. That brings down their cost of living, but that's not reflected in the CPI. Well, in concept, it shouldn't be. That's not maintaining a constant standard of living. Very openly, they wanted to help bring down the budget deficit, and that was the idea was that if they could reduce the level of inflation being reported in the CPI, they could reduce the cost of living adjustments to Social Security payments, for example.
Low middle income people, poor people. I think it especially hits hard low middle income people who are trying to make it on their own and won't go on the dole because their prices go up more and they're the first ones to lose their job when the business cycle turns down. The Federal Reserve, by increasing the credit, creates the boom part of the cycle, but then there's always the resulting downturn of the cycle when unemployment rises. And I remember clearly in the 1970s that phenomenon that seemed to baffle the economists at that time, but not the Austrian economists, not Mises and Rothbard, because at that time the economy turned down, we had a weak economy, and prices were going up. And so they had to come up with this new term, oh, we have stagflation. I wonder where it came from.
Inflation measure no longer measures the cost of maintaining a constant standard of living. And the effect is that had these changes not been made, Social Security checks would be about double what they are today. So they, for political reasons on both sides of the aisle, nobody wanted to vote against Social Security. Nobody will talk about bringing Social Security under control. They changed the inflation reporting.
And that's the way this place operates.
During the conservative era, real wages rose, while during the progressive era, real wages have been almost flat since 1972.
Average earnings peaked back in 1973, before the onset of the 73-75 recession. Never recovered since, still down about 10% year over year. The effect there was that as individuals could not make ends meet, that of course reduced family income. Back in the 70s, it was more common that a household would have one person working, usually the husband, with the wife staying home with the kids. Today, normally you have at least two people working in a family, but the families are still not making ends meet.
I hate this house and I don't want to be here anymore.
The political philosophers who engineered the progressive era redefined the economic political spectrum. They did this by placing communism on the far left and fascism on the far right.
Generally, they say that on the extreme left of the political spectrum, there's communism. And on the other side, there's the extreme right is supposed to be Nazism or fascism and so forth. After many years of thinking about that and observing it, I came suddenly to the conclusion one day that there's no difference between the extreme right and the extreme left. They both are philosophies based on the concept of collectivism, the concept that the state is all powerful.
But since both communism and fascism are dictatorships, any voter trying to steer a rational, moderate course would naturally assume he wanted to be equidistant from these two extremes, in the middle of the spectrum.
But what does the person in the middle believe? Usually he doesn't believe in anything, and so he's chosen to say, I'm a moderate, I'm in the middle, because he's not prepared to defend what he believes. So it's the easy way out. I'm in the middle. Who can argue with that?
But guess what is now in the middle of this contrived spectrum? welfarism. This spectrum makes welfarism look like a moderate position because it's been fudged in between capitalism and socialism. Socialism defined as a milder form of communism, and capitalism defined as a milder form of fascism.
So we come back to the question of a political spectrum. It's kind of misleading, especially today in this country. We're being given this false choice of left and right in American politics. We're being told that on the right we've got the Republican Party and on the left we've got the Democrat Party. So which side are you going to be on?
The real political spectrum is a spectrum that describes the size of the government, not the type of government.
I don't think it can be anything other than a spectrum that goes from zero government on one side to 100% government on the other. Now, if you're on the zero side, you've got anarchy, you've got no government. The other side of the political spectrum would be 100% government. Communism, socialism, fascism, Nazism, princes, potentates, dictators, kings, whatever. If it's total government, that's the left. The right, anarchy. So that's the political spectrum as it should be taught. It's not being taught that way.
The real political spectrum does not concern itself with what's liberal or what's conservative, as these terms are relative to viewpoint, hence not objective. What one person wants to liberally change, the next wants to conservatively keep. So the politically correct spectrum is meaningless for the citizen that's looking for objective truth.
Today, the political spectrum is communism is on the left and Nazism and fascism are on the right, which is ridiculous. If there were ever any blood brothers, it would be fascism, communism, Nazism. They're all blood brothers. So what's the proper? Limited self-government, where the government is limited by law, a republic, and the people are limited by freely accepted moral codes like the Ten Commandments.
Since both fascism and communism are dictatorships, they both require governments of immense size to operate. Many laws and regulations are required to keep the citizens in line.
There really isn't a lot of philosophical, let's go back to that word, philosophical difference between the two major parties. They both want to grow the federal government. I've often said the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats at the national level is the Democrats want to tax and spend, and the Republicans want to borrow and spend. But they still both want to spend. They want to grow the federal government. And none of them want to reduce the overall size and scope of the federal government. The Republicans had the opportunity to do so from 2000 to 2006 when they controlled the entire federal government. They did nothing.
So the political spectrum that's being taught and that's being discussed is rubbish.
So you can see that by redefining the political spectrum, political philosophers have been able to shift the welfare state to the center and capitalism off to the right. With the welfare state fudged into the center of the spectrum, modern political philosophers have been able to morally justify the endless expansion of government for the purpose of providing welfare for the common good.
The leadership of these parties are all collectivists. That means they believe in big government. They want bigger government. It gives more power to themselves and to their cronies. It's their style, it's their goal. Collectivism, total government, total global government. They call it the New World Order. That's their phrase for it. They're in love with government. They dream of more and more power for government. They dream of themselves in these positions of power, ruling the lives of the people of the world. That's why we keep having more government, because we keep following the same leaders.
The great 13th century philosopher Thomas Aquinas rightly pointed out that promoting the common good was desirable, but not by endlessly expanding the state.
Aquinas, of course, was the author of the Summa Theologica. He's the angelic doctor of the Catholic faith, and he's a great teacher of natural law. And he argued and contended that charitable giving was good for the giver and, of course, good for the recipient, good for the soul. What has happened is, in America and in other welfare states, the government comes in and replaces the individual and tries to reap the benefit from the recipient and become the author of all charity. And to get the benefit of that, the politicians vote enormous amounts of wealth and money and transfer it from one people to another, and in that way they can get the benefit of their vote. So something that was voluntary and individual and positive turns into something that is coercive. Government takes from A and gives to B in order that it will get the benefit of the transaction, rather than it being a transaction between two individuals.
But some insist, what's wrong with a strong, beneficent state, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau might say? What's wrong with altruism, as Auguste Comte might say? What's wrong with a classless, egalitarian society, as Karl Marx might say? Unfortunately, there is a lot wrong with these old world philosophies, for the ideas of Rousseau, Comte, and Marx must be thoroughly rejected if one wishes to accept the ideas of Locke, Jefferson, and Adam Smith.
Philosophies of Rousseau and Comte and Marx are all directed towards collectivism, centralized political and economic control over society, ultimately by a small group, an elite group. Obviously, on the other side, the philosophies of the Founding Fathers in the United States were based on the opposite concept of individualism. They recognize that a governmental structure is necessary, but that governmental structure has to be strictly controlled for the benefit of, as it were, the average man, the common individual. We the people, as the Constitution says. Where the Marxian view or the positivist view, Comte was really a positivist socialist. They look at it from top-down organization. There's an elite of wise men who are going to determine everything for everyone else. And that type of a system is based essentially on a coercive model of society, a hierarchical, pyramidal model of society, where power flows up and commands flow down, and the further you get from the top, the more you're subject to control. Whereas our system of government, essentially the other way around, real sovereignty and power is supposed to lie in the hands of the people at the bottom of the pyramid, as opposed to the small number of people at the top in the state governments or the federal government in Washington, D.C.
The founders of the United States studied philosophy like no others. They were aware of the effects of various political philosophies, from Plato to Aristotle, to Cicero, Aquinas, and Machiavelli to Locke. They were aware of what kinds of governments arose from what kinds of philosophies. They were aware that governments that offered their citizens candy, such as special privileges, entitlements, handouts, subsidies, welfare, and stimulus packages, were ultimately involved in subterfuge. For the act of handing out political candy gives those in power the ability to control and dominate society as well.
Nothing in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights suggests a two-party system should dominate American politics and government. And the founders never intended for such a system to take over the American political process. The two-party political system has disturbing moral, legal, and constitutional problems when viewed within the context of the constitutional framework.
Because the state does not actually create wealth. Any time the federal government provides something to a citizen, corporation, special interest group, or even a state, it must forcibly take something away from others.
You must leave.
Worse, any time the federal government grants welfare, it expects to regulate the recipients of that welfare. The founders knew about this trap. They knew that cries for altruism and the greatest good were ways that governments had justified their expansion and subjugation of the people for centuries.
Well, to justify their expansion, governments almost always use the false ideas of the prominent intellectuals of their day. Let me give you an example. Back in the 1930s, we were afflicted with the Great Depression, and naturally everyone was looking around to see if they could figure out what had caused it. Well, a very prominent economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes came along, and he explained it in this way. Capitalism had reached its mature stage and could no longer generate enough demand in order to be workable. So the government, in order to solve this problem, the government had to intervene in massive ways to inflate the money supply in large ways, to regulate all the prices and wages of the economy. Basic intellectuals of the day, the pundits and the politicians, bought into this. And so we were launched into the big government welfare state age, and we're still in it. The Austrian School of Economics in the 1930s, headed up by Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, stated vehemently, no, Keynes was incorrect. There was no such thing as a mature stage of capitalism. That was ludicrous. Capitalism never reached a mature stage. It would constantly regenerate if it was just left alone. But unfortunately, the politicians and pundits and the people bought into Keynes, and we're still subject to his false ideas to this very day.
Keynesian economics generally advocates the use of government deficit spending to stimulate economic activity. The Austrian school looks at it from the standpoint of growth in the money supply. The growth of money supply is directly related to the purchasing power of the currency. In the Keynesian school, the concern about inflation and the long-term purchasing power of the dollar is relegated to way down the list of desirable results.
Politicians will use the false ideas of the prominent intellectuals of their day to expand their power over our lives.
Altruism is thought to be kindness toward our fellow man. But Auguste Comte, the philosopher who coined the term 150 years ago, defined it as sacrifice of the individual to humanity. And all modern-day collectivists think of it this way, as sacrifice rather than benevolence.
Well, you can't very well, as a politician, come to an individual and say, listen, I'd like you to accept oppression in your life. I'd like you to accept decreases in your purchasing power of your money or decreases in your economic welfare. Obviously, that's not something that's saleable. So you have to present it in a more sugar-coated version. Sometimes it's, you're going to receive something from this program. That's the obvious one of self-interest. And the next level is, well, someone else is going to receive it who really deserves this, and you need to participate altruistically, as it were, and provide for the common good. Now, of course, the concept of the common good is not something that's contrary to the American constitutional system of government. One of the principles of the preamble is the general welfare, which is another way of stating the common good. But it's a concept that can easily be abused because it's fairly abstract, and most people don't really ask to see what is, as it were, the mechanistic connection between some program that a politician wants to put in and how they and everyone else may benefit from this program.
This is why the United States was designed to be a republic, based on a limited government and not a democracy subject to mob dictating entitlements. Given this, a limited Republican government would be the golden mean, such found at the center of the real political spectrum, along with its natural analog of free market capitalism. But is this the way it is today? Hardly. And the reason for this is because for the past 97 years, the American people have been flip-flopping between the same two political parties. Parties that are now using an old world strategy to stay in power, buying votes with endless welfare candy.
Well, the old world strategy is what drove so many people to cross the ocean and come here, or go through Ellis Island and become Americans. The old world strategy was to dole out entitlements, and of course it stifled industry, it stifled the ability of people to keep the fruits of their labor. The old world strategy is what was rejected by our founding fathers. And they gave us a limited government, free society, and many of them left everything and came here. They came penniless. They saw their children rise to the next level, their grandchildren to another. They became professional people and artisans and so forth. America was a place where upward mobility could be accomplished, much more so than anywhere else in the world.
Given the philosophical climate we're now in, the Demopublicans have fully adapted to the welfare state such justified by altruism. Unfortunately, providing endless candy costs endless money. Where is the money going to come from? It would come in 1913. From that year on, the United States steadily declined as a result of two major events: the founding of the Federal Reserve System and the levy of the income tax.
If you define slavery as the degree to which a master can control your life, not by showing up and bowing before them and say, "Yes, master, give me an order," it's by means of sending money to them. In most countries, we give at least 60% of our earnings in general to the government in the form of taxes. That's not only income tax, it's excise tax, it's sales tax, it's tax on every time you do a certain financial transaction. There's a bank tax. Every time you pay your telephone bill, there's a tax that goes to the government. When you get all those taxes added together, it's at least 60%. And then you add on top of that the degree to which most people are in debt. They have borrowed money from the banks, and if they're going to buy a car, let's say that would normally cost, let's say $10,000, they'll buy it on time. They'll get a contract for it, and by the time the 3 or 5 years are up, they will probably pay $15,000 or $16,000 for it. And that extra $6,000 goes to the bank in the form of interest. They don't even think about that, but that's money that they had to earn, and they have to pay that. So when you add the debt, the interest on debt that people pay to the amount of taxes they pay, well, you add the numbers. I'm going to guess that most people in the Western world today are probably 70 to 80, 85% slave already, and they don't even know it.
Thus, here is where the money to fund the welfare state was to come from: debt and taxes. Endless debt and endless taxes. In other words, welcome to today's fiat currency-driven, overtaxed society. With the advent of the neoconservatives, the Republican Party jumped into the hot tub with the Democrats in a mad frenzy to provide handouts in exchange for votes. Thus, the welfare state is now not only a product of the Democrats, but the Republicans as well. And a myriad of intellectuals, clergy, and media justified it by not only succumbing to cultural Marxism, but the misplaced altruism of Comte and the bastardization of Aquinas' philosophy of the common good.
Basically, cultural Marxism is a product of Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, who was probably the more successful communist, even than Mao and Lenin, since their revolutions have collapsed, and Gramsci's revolution has triumphed in the West. And what Gramsci decided when he went to Lenin's Russia, he looked at that and he looked at the world Stalin, Lenin, and Trotsky were building, and he says, they've got power and they've got control of the state, but they don't have the allegiance and loyalty of the people. The people hate them. They hate the regime, they hate the party, they love Mother Russia, they love their Christian faith. And he said the way that cultural Marxism will triumph and we have a revolution in the world is to have a revolution in the heart and soul. And what we have to do then, we have to burn out or grout out Christianity from all the institutions and schools and culture of the West so that a new people come up who don't believe what their parents and grandparents believed, and they're basically a tabula rasa, a clean slate on which we can write our message. And that is the great triumph of cultural Marxism, that in effect it may have won the culture war, and culture is upstream from politics. In other words, you change the culture and the politics that are downstream will be changed with it.
Is it thus any wonder establishment political philosophers have been obfuscating the real political spectrum? The Democrats, and now the Republicans, are taking the country down the road to totalitarianism.
Both the Democrats and the Republicans at the national level are leading us down the road toward totalitarianism. They're coming at it maybe from slightly different angles, but the net result is the same. The Democrats often use that general welfare clause of the Constitution to justify all this social spending and welfare spending. The GOP, their rubric is protecting us. Ever since 9/11/2001, we have gone through this, the USA Patriot Act and the emergence of the Department of Homeland Security, and look what's going on at the airports with TSA, and everything is for our protection. Everything is for our security.
The history of the world shows that every government that existed prior to the founding of the United States in 1776 tended toward oligarchy, government by a small elite group, and some were more repressive and dictatorial than others. And every such government justified its existence and necessary size by the philosophies of promoting the general will, the greatest good for the greatest number, the common good, the general welfare, and the virtue of altruism.
An oligarchy is a very few people at the top who have become dominant, right? You can have that with a monarchy, you can have it in a socialist type system, in a communist system. The Politburo in the Soviet Union was an oligarchy that ran everything. Mussolini in Italy, he had his own Politburo. Under him, Hitler, of course, had his small group that ruled. Here we're supposed to have self-rule. The people are supposed to rule themselves, and the government is supposed to be limited. The Constitution limiting the powers of government. I like to point to the Constitution, the very first sentence in it. All legislative powers herein granted are vested in Congress. But you've all heard that a Supreme Court decision is the law of the land, haven't you? Well, how can that be? Because all lawmaking power is in Congress. So what then is a Supreme Court decision? It's the law of the case. It's all wrong, right? Now you got another branch of government, the executive branch. The executive branch, you'll find the president issuing executive orders. The Environmental Protection Agency was started by an executive order signed by Richard Nixon. It didn't even go through Congress, right? So they're making law with executive orders. Is that proper? And I defy anybody to find education, housing, transportation, energy, medicine, foreign aid. I defy anybody to find that in the Constitution. It's not there. So what we've got is a rule developing by a powerful few who set the tone, and most congressmen, most senators have as their main goal getting reelected. And so they will do what the oligarchy in the building wants. It's growing, right? The headquarters, we say, is at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City, a private organization started in 1921 to promote the idea of world government. Forget the Declaration of Independence, forget the Constitution. Let's have a world government run by us.
In other words, the old world view of government. The new world view that existed in America for a brief period between 1776 and 1913 could be summed up by the term individualism.
In a democracy, the majority rules, period. End of discussion. In a republic, the majority rules up to the point of taking away the rights of individuals. The majority, the mathematical concept of more votes, is fine so long as it's not taken to the point where it denies the inherent rights of individuals and minorities. So that guy who's at the end of the rope, his vote under those conditions is superior in a republic to all the votes of the people out there clamoring for his death. They've got to follow the rules, the constitutional rules. The Constitution in a republic sets down limitations on what the government can do. That means limitations on what the majority can do. The Constitution Bill of Rights starts off with the government shall pass no law restricting the right of peaceful assembly, the right to bear arms, all of these things. Not if the majority says so. It says no law. Congress shall pass no law. That means the majority shall do nothing to deny a man's right, freedom of speech, peaceful assembly, right to bear arms, and all the rest of the rights of human beings. And a very important concept. So when collectivists say that individuals must be sacrificed for the greater good of the greater number, therein lies the foundation for tyranny.
Promote individual ability, and you will automatically build a strong national collective. But if one sets out to build a strong collective, all they will end up building are cowed, dependent citizens who eventually become dominated by an oversized, tyrannical state.
Is this something that some people really want? Yes, indeed. It's something that some people really want.
It was at the end of World War II that you began to see the rise of the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and further along we have the World Trade Organization, the Kyoto Protocol, the Treaty of Rome on crimes against humanity and crimes by soldiers. And all of these institutions are the embryonic institutions of a world government. And the model for world government is the European Union. And there was talk then of a North American Union, of the United States, Canada, and Mexico merging with a single currency. And all of these things were designed to bring the whole world under an oligarchy who would prevent all wars and make sure the economy ran for the benefit of all.
Practically every one of the governments in the old world was a repressive and dictatorial oligarchy with a collectivist mentality. The idea of God-given rights for citizens wasn't even on the horizon. Then, along came philosophic minds like Locke, Jefferson, Smith, Adams, Madison, Henry, and Paine. In other words, the guiding geniuses and founding fathers of the United States.
The great solution to both the idea that man is basically good or that evil is in property is the historic Western civilization idea that man is fallen, but he has the potential to do good. And with checks and balances and with free enterprise, we will bring out the best. And that's what made, in my humble opinion, America the most free and most successful nation in the history of the world. I think we need to return to free enterprise, recognizing, yes, capitalists can be wicked, but what we do need to see is that capitalism inspires people to achieve, rewards those who do good, and a government that recognizes that man can do evil will keep capitalists from abusing the world with their property. In doing those things, we're saying no to Rousseau, no to Marx, yes to the historic Judeo-Christian system envisioned by Christian philosophers like John Locke, Blackstone, and others that had an idea that the scriptures give us guidance for our foundational principles. These were the men that our founders followed when they established our country.
There was a small group of men who drafted the Constitution, and they did have the power. They were the rulers in a sense. They had the power to do whatever they wanted to at the end of the American Revolution. Nevertheless, they chose to use that power in such a way as to diffuse their own power in the future and to diffuse it for those who came afterwards. Unfortunately, the concept that they created of a republic, the limitations of power on government, it didn't last for more than about 80 or 100 years, but they had a great concept. It was a great beta model. And I think that what we need to do now is acquire a greater respect for this beta model that they created and try and get forward to that position. I don't say go back to it because we've been slipping backward toward the old world all these years.
To promote this collectivist resurgence, the world's top bankers secretly met on Jekyll Island in 1910 and conspired to impose an old world, European-style central bank on the American people. This scheme, which became the Federal Reserve Act 3 years later, would eventually remove all gold and silver backing from the currency and relegate U.S. citizens to the slavery of serving endless debt. Debt based on fiat currency printed out of thin air.
Certain special interest groups want to use fiat currency, want to have fiat currency as the basic monetary system in the United States. Number two, the political forces, politicians in Washington, people in public office, have allowed this to happen. And that's essentially sufficient. The third point is that the average American doesn't understand this and hasn't opposed it. Ultimately, that's the real reason. And essentially the bankers and the financial people that are interested in having that kind of a system, that's fine. They would much rather have the average person living off in the dark on this particular subject. Difficulty for them is that the fiat currency system is inherently unstable. And it systematically breaks down again and again and again in American history. We've had this kind of a system going on since the early 1800s, and there have been a series of essentially breakdowns.
They abused the system that we had at that time. They created too much credit. They did not live by the rules of the gold standard. There was a panic. People were losing money. Depositors were losing money. So it was designed to protect those particular individuals. Instead of maintaining a currency and maintaining a sound currency, they were trying to protect the special interest by bailing them out, and that is being able to create credit when they came up short of credit. So they were actually rejecting the marketplace, which operates to solve these kind of problems.
Upon this so-called elastic currency, the modern welfare warfare state has been erected over the past 97 years. Totalitarian mentalities of the old world have reached out from the grave and splattered their collectivist philosophies into the American experiment. An experiment, until then, of limited self-government and laissez-faire capitalism that has built the most successful free nation the world has ever known. Now we're back in the mud.
Madison did not foresee or anticipate an event that would occur about 75 years later that would shatter the foundation of the Republic, the American Civil War. The nation divided itself into two large warring factions, and the Democrat and Republican parties, as they exist today, emerged out of the ashes of that horrible divide. This duopoly between the Democrats and Republicans really boiled down to money, to economics. With the people in the South using slaves, it gave them an economic advantage. They didn't have to pay them.
But these parties also support and use additional tools, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, the UN, the IMF World Bank, the World Trade Organization, NAFTA, GATT, and the World Court.
Now, candidates from the Council on Foreign Relations, Democrat and Republican, have dominated the American system since the end of World War II. Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Nixon, Carter, Ford. If they weren't members of the Council on Foreign Relations, they were surrounded by people who were, from both political parties. The last campaign, we had John McCain, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, as the Republican candidate. Barack Obama, surrounded by people in the Council on Foreign Relations. He's added 400 people from that organization to his government.
I think it's obvious that there will never be reform coming from either Democrat or Republican Party, and it's certainly clear that both parties are following the path of collectivism. They're trying to appease the class of voters who are expecting and demanding benefits. They're expecting and demanding that they receive money from other people in society because it's their right, it's their entitlement. So as long as that condition exists, it's obvious that true reform in the American system will never come from either of the two major political parties.
This is why a third political party is needed. The Democrats and Republicans are always inhibited from confronting certain touchy issues that are necessary for genuine reform.
A war in Iraq over weapons of mass destruction, a drug prescription benefit called Part D, and they're talking about who owes the bill?
Whether, he has other negatives you're going to vote for that person because it's kind of like you have no choice because the other person isn't for your issues or your values. So it's like the lesser of the two evils.
Reform can't come from either of the entrenched parties, and this is because our progressive rate tax system is so warped in this country. It allows 50% of the voters to pay zero taxes and next to zero taxes. This allows them to get their government services basically for free. And this has created infinite demand for government services. It's a cardinal law of economics. If government benefits are free or nearly free, demand for them will be infinite. And the Republicans realize this. They come in front of the electorate. They know the voters want increased spending every year because 50% of them are not paying anything for that spending. So the answer to the dilemma that we're in is to eliminate infinite demand for government services. But that requires an equal rate tax across the board for everyone. You pass a proportional tax where everybody has to pay something for their government services, and you have stifled infinite demand for those services. But only a third party can do that because only a third party is willing to tell the truth to the people and risk losing the election in the process.
All a third-party candidate has to do is present a new vision of what we could do as a nation to solve our problems. This new vision could stimulate some much-needed change.
Of course, to the extent that the two parties have to follow the same policy directives, there can never be change. That's a simple answer. You really have one party with two faces, and you may change the personalities, you may change the party label, but the same programs are put in over and over again.
Many Americans intuitively know that no change means a continual drift towards more government and totalitarianism. But still, third parties have not been able to prevail with a new vision since the Republican Party superseded the Whig Party in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln.
The first thing that you need to do to convince, I would think, the average American, the average voter, that a new political group is worth supporting, besides the basic platform that they may present to you, is, do these people actually have a chance of succeeding essentially in my lifetime, in the short term? Can they give me some positive result from my support of them? The unfortunate thing with the Libertarians or the Constitutional Party and some of these other parties is they tend to talk in abstractions. And the abstractions are very general, very diffuse. I think the average person looks at them and says, well, this is pie-in-the-sky political promising.
Ross Perot's Reform Party, the Libertarian Party, and the Constitution Party have all presented hope from time to time. However, each has failed to get enough votes because they've made one of two vital mistakes. They have either marginalized themselves in the public mind or presented themselves as clones of an existing party.
Both Brown and Phillips campaigned with the Libertarian Party and the Constitution Party. They campaigned on the dissolution of the welfare state. Well, this naturally scared the daylights out of the American people, so the voters gave them less than 1% of the vote every time they ran. And even Ron Paul himself succumbed to this to a certain degree in his campaign in 2008 for the presidency. When he was on the Jay Leno show, he said he was going to get rid of the income tax completely and replace it with nothing.
Now, I know you also want to do away with abolishing the IRS, is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I mean, how do you do that? Because, don't you find, I find, no matter what money you give government, they seem to spend twice as much.
That's right.
So you want to cut it.
I lean toward a flat tax, but I want to make it real flat, like zero.
Well, this also scared the daylights out of the American people. If you're going to eliminate the income tax and replace it with nothing, the income tax took in $1.4 trillion in revenue in 2008. You've got to get rid of $1.4 trillion in government services for the people. That scares the daylights out of them.
Marginalization and cloning are the primary reasons no third political party has been successful in challenging the Demopublican monopoly. Though their vision may be correct, the public can't assimilate it. these parties have lost sight of the idea that politics is a game of incrementalism. The public subconsciously knows this, for it realizes that one can't just instantly abolish the income tax or the Federal Reserve System.
If we didn't fuel the government with that kind of money created out of nothing, which of course is paid for through inflation, then they wouldn't have the money to even come close to making all of the welfare payments and obligations that they have undertaken. So if we got rid of the fiat money system, welfare would collapse. It would be impossible. In fact, most of what the government is spending would be impossible.
Third parties thus marginalize themselves by expressing visions that seem too drastic or provide no incremental solutions. Thus, neither the Libertarian or Constitution Party has ever received more than 1% of the vote. Instead, they're considered fringe, utopians, and mostly ignored. This is what it means to be marginalized.
What we mean by cloning is when a third political party advocates pretty much the same message that the two major parties are advocating. For example, back in the 1990s when Ross Perot formed the Reform Party, the Reform Party basically cloned itself to the Democrats and Republicans because it preached a big government vision that didn't differentiate itself in any discernible way from the welfare state vision of the Democrats and Republicans. So it cloned itself. And the people reasoned that, well, do we really need we have two big government parties, do we need a third big government party? And they reasoned no. What we need is a small government party that offers a small government vision to the people.
Just cloning another political party is not going to be of much value. Regardless of how you start out, regardless of what your stated principles are, regardless of what your platform is to start off, you have to look at the long view. Parties don't stay the same. They change. They change depending on who migrates into positions of power. They change on where the money comes from to support the party. And unless the party structure has a built-in mechanism to resist those kinds of corrupting influences, then I would say it would be just another clone job and probably would end up exactly in the hands of the same people who now run the Republican and the Democrat Party.
Because of its desire to immediately win the presidency, the Reform Party, for instance, became too similar to the Democrats and Republicans. While a Libertarian Party advocates too much radicalness, a Reform Party advocates no radicalness.
What a third party candidate has to do is advocate policy that is just radical enough to differentiate itself from the Republicans and the Democrats, but not so radical that it marginalizes itself like the Libertarian Party and the Constitution Party have done.
Not only does an existing or new third party have to avoid marginalization and cloning, it has to address vital issues, not just popcorn issues that Democrats and Republicans bat back and forth all day long on national TV.
You wouldn't have to be different, just break out of the mold a little bit, and that would be helpful. But
given that the U.S. Republic has been mired in endless debt and taxation, and this debt and taxation has been the drug used to keep the welfare warfare state stimulated and constantly expanding, a third party should make these addictions its primary domestic issues.
The way the tax system is today in the United States, from the income side, it's graduated. The more money you make, the higher percentage of the incremental increase in income that the government takes from you in taxes.
If you have different tax rates for different factions of society, then you don't have equal rights. In order to have equal rights under the law, you have to have an equal rate tax system. This is what the Constitution says. Article 1, Section 8 states that equal tax rates must prevail throughout the land. And this was the law of the land up until 1913, when the Supreme Court justices very conveniently looked the other way under the socialistic influence of their day.
Abolishing the income tax from America is the ultimate goal of any libertarian or conservative, but this can't be done overnight. The first step is to end progressive rates. How is it fair that some Americans are charged at a rate of 50%, while others are charged 20%, and still others are charged nothing at all? How does this square with principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence, where all citizens are supposed to have equality under law?
What we have done is we have allowed the blindfolded goddess of justice to lift the blindfold and peek. She now says to the taxpayer, to the American citizen, first tell me who you are and what your status is in life, and I will tell you how the tax laws apply to you. Well, this is arbitrary law, the harbinger of every dictatorship that has ever come down through history. But unfortunately, this is what we are subject to today in modern America, arbitrary dictatorial law.
What do we mean by a sound monetary system? Article 1, Sections 8 and 10 of the United States Constitution state that the lawful money of the United States must be gold and silver coin. Further, Article 1 states that bills of credit are not permitted. From 1913, when the Federal Reserve System was established, until the present day, the U.S. government and the elite bankers have partnered to create what's known as fiat money.
It was banking interests that were behind it. Powerful banking interests because they wanted their assets protected. They wanted the Federal Reserve to be the lender of last resort. So if there was if they had been loaning out and risking the money and these loans go bad, instead of having the market take care of this, they wanted bailed out. And this is why it was a tremendous popular thing to do for the banks and, of course, the big business people who were borrowing the money. They wanted to be the lenders of last resort, which means that if you print the money, the real victim is the people who are holding the dollars and lose the value of their money. So it was very, very special interest directed, and it was designed for the elite.
Today, the money of the United States, in violation of the United States Constitution, is nothing but paper and worthless metal tokens. The ability for a government to print money on demand and then lend it to the economy is like a heroin addict having the ability to acquire all the heroin he wants and injecting it into his brain. Eventually, the brain, like the government, is going to have a meltdown. This is not a very sound monetary system.
The problem of moving away from the Federal Reserve System, I don't believe can be addressed at the level of Congress, simply because the people behind the Federal Reserve System have too much political influence at that level. That's number one. Number two, mechanistically speaking, you can't simply change the Federal Reserve System overnight, because the whole economy in the United States is based upon Federal Reserve note as the currency, bank credit, at least to industry. That can't be not merely changed or removed overnight. You have to produce something else to put in its place.
At least the coins he was making had some intrinsic value.
All right, and the Federal Reserve note isn't even worth the paper it's printed on, literally. Why wouldn't the government go after Ben Bernanke for being a domestic terrorist?
Well, in actuality, our Federal Reserve notes are counterfeit. Today, there's no difference between the Federal Reserve notes that the Fed counterfeits or the ones that a criminal would counterfeit, because neither one of them are backed by gold, because a note has to be a promise to pay, and the Federal Reserve notes don't pay anything.
So what I would propose is that a state government sets up an alternative currency, starts using it itself, and you would quickly see that it would be used within the private economy of that state. And then that alternative currency would compete against Federal Reserve notes. And if that competition were in favor of the alternative currency, that is, if the free market saw that alternative currency as better than Federal Reserve notes, that alternative currency would be picked up and used in other states and slowly spread throughout the total economy. This is the way the euro was introduced.
The system really is a Ponzi scheme as we're living through it right now. It works as long as the money supply continues to expand and expand and expand, like any Ponzi scheme. You pay off the first investors so that they're very happy. They bring in the new investors. As long as it expands, it works. But when it finally stops, the whole thing comes to an end. That's why they have to keep expanding the money supply.
A successful third political party would thus address the need to incrementally bring this wayward monetary system back under the principles set forth in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Given the unsustainable welfare and warfare state we have built the past 97 years, only powerful but misguided political philosophers could have indoctrinated so many millions of minds into the belief that there is such a thing as a free lunch, or that governments must forcibly collect money from citizens in order to help the poor.
Liberalism has as its desire to care for the needy and the poor. There is a real care and concern for those who face the difficulties of this world. I think Margaret Thatcher said the problem with liberalism is that sooner or later you run out of your neighbor's money to spend.
The poor are helped by raising the general welfare, meaning increased economic freedom and productivity, not by allowing a multi-trillion-dollar parasite into the food chain. Contrary to the politically correct philosophy of the day, the state robs the poor like no other. And often those who scream loudest about concern for the poor are really screaming because they don't want the responsibility of helping the poor to fall upon their shoulders. They want the state to take care of it.
The ones who are screaming the loudest for helping the poor have no intention of digging into their own pockets and doing it themselves. They want to set in motion a political structure that will do it, and that they intend to benefit from being a part of that political structure.
So what the government has done is supplant private individuals and private charities and churches, and having done so, it has benefited enormously, at least the political parties that have done that.
And then you couple that with the rules and the regulations, the stipulations, the requirements that go along with the, quote, the gift. The idea that Christians especially would accept this concept of government charity, I think shows a great naivete on their part.
Unfortunately, the valid doctrine handed down by Aquinas, that we should provide for the common good, has been hijacked and perverted by the state and the collectivist mentalities that surround it like so many flies around cotton candy. For those who really want to help the poor, and the middle class for that matter, the progressive era and the Keynesian welfare state are no answers.
Keynes, when he wrote his General Theory, which is a famous work that he did, in the German version of this, in the preface, he makes a statement that his theory would be much more easily applied in Germany than it would be in England at the time. Well, who was in control of Germany at the time that Keynes wrote that book? It was Adolf Hitler. Right? Even Keynes recognized that his theory was one that was much more easily applied by a centralized, coercive, totalitarian type regime than a free market-oriented, individualist, limited government regime. Now, the Austrian economic system, Austrian economists come at it from an entirely different perspective. They analyze the economy from the basis of the individual on up, recognizing the necessity for limited government, recognizing the necessity for free markets, recognizing the necessity for sound money as opposed to fiat currency or managed currency. And the question, which one is going to succeed? Well, I think to be realistic, the Austrian one is the only one that can succeed because it's the only one that's really realistic.
John Maynard Keynes is the author of the attitude that you can spend your way into prosperity. Okay? No, you can't spend your way into prosperity.
As the founders well knew, the cry of altruism is one of the grand justifiers collectivists and totalitarians have used for millennia. So how could a third party improve these conditions? The first step is for a third-party candidate to gain entrance into the national presidential TV debates. This means such candidate must get at least 15% in the polls. Accomplishing this will give the third party the ability to address 70 million voters, where the obtuseness and corruption of the Democrats and Republicans can be challenged.
We have a strange situation because we have a process in Washington where after you've served for a while, you cash in, become a foreign lobbyist, make $30,000 a month, then take a leave, work on presidential campaigns, make sure you got good contacts, and then go back out.
We don't want a system of essentially monopoly or oligopoly control for political parties. We want a system of free and open competition. But in the political realm, it's quite easy to exclude competition because you're dealing with the governmental process to begin with. So here they've done it. They go and they create this mechanism of presidential debates to keep the people from hearing alternative positions.
The Commission on Presidential Debates is the sponsor of this event and the 3 other presidential and vice presidential debates coming in October.
The Commission on Presidential Debates is about as phony as you can imagine. It is completely dominated by the 2 major political parties.
As we welcome Senators Obama and McCain.
The fraud is that if you represent a point of view or a constituency or support outside of the major political parties, you do not get to be entered into the debates.
The Presidential Debate Commission is a condominium between the 2 parties to make sure the presidency is handed back and forth between them, and nobody else gets in on the game. It's like a conspiracy between Pepsi and Coke to make sure 7-Up is not sold. And that's exactly what it is, a political conspiracy of the 2 parties. Perot broke it when he was enormously high in the polls. You couldn't keep him out of the debates. But now what they've got is a situation where it's a catch-22. You have to have 15% to get into the debates, but if you don't get into the debates, you don't get 15%. And there's a real possibility, I think, that if you had a third-party candidate, the incumbent president, just as Jimmy Carter, would not debate John Anderson and Ronald Reagan because he was afraid that John Anderson, if he was elevated, would take votes from him and sink him. So the 2 parties have a conspiracy and a common interest in denying any third-party candidate a chance to win any election.
The new party will have to offer reform that will appeal to enough Americans to garner 38% of the vote. This would result in a win in a 3-man election. All political polls show this is possible at this critical time in history. The time is ripe.
Is it time for an independent candidate or a third political party to win the presidency?
Oh, that'd be amazing.
All right.
It's time.
Thank you very much.
It was a moral issue of the highest order, and people began to worry about the Dred Scott case decision that opened up the expansion of slavery across America. And instantly, there was a whole new party that began to speak against the immorality of slavery and its expansion. And it created a new movement that brought ultimately Lincoln to the prominence in the election. That shows us that there is the possibility that there are moral cases or national cases of such interest that it galvanizes the people, and they will rise up and say, if an existing party is not addressing this well, we will address it, and we will bring attention to it.
Restricting the ballot to 2 parties yields up First Amendment problems, antitrust problems, and separation of powers problems, all of which, when taken as a whole, create a system that is operating in violation of well-established law and constitutional prescriptions against what they are doing or attempting to do.
I am honored to be here with Barack Obama. I am absolutely honored.
For the first time in polling history, the Democrats and Republicans each get only about 30% of the vote, with 40% going to independents. These independents, combined with millions of Tea Party voters, could easily give a third-party candidate 38% of the vote, especially if the new party ran a nationally known candidate, possessed with some serious gravitas, and such candidate addressed the following demands. 1. Americans want the income tax made simple and uniform.
This entails enacting a 10% equal rate tax across the board for everyone. No privileges, no deductions, no exemptions for anybody.
2. Americans want the Federal Reserve tamed.
This entails enacting Milton Friedman's 4% auto expansion plan for the Federal Reserve, which will mandate by law that the Federal Reserve can expand the money supply no faster than 4% every year. This will bring a monetary expansion into alignment with the growth of goods and services, and this will result in a 0% price inflation every year. Now, the combine of these first two pillars of reform will bring about a tremendous explosion in economic growth and wealth creation for everybody.
3. They want illegal aliens to stop invading the U.S.
This entails mandating English as the official language of America. It also entails prohibiting all welfare perks and anchor baby rights for illegal immigrants, and prosecuting all employers who hire illegal immigrants with a stiff fine and a jail sentence if necessary. This would reduce the illegal immigrant invasion to a mere trickle.
And 4. They want to restore a mind-our-own-business foreign policy.
We stop trying to be the policeman for the world. We get back to what the Founding Fathers had in mind, which is protection of the nation's security and survival. And we don't need 820 bases in 135 countries throughout the world to do that.
Thus, a third-party candidate who ran vigorously on those 4 planks would not only be able to make it into the presidential TV debates, but win on Election Day.
We've shipped millions of jobs overseas. Now, if you just want to get down to brass tacks, first thing you ought to do is get all these folks who've got these one-way trade agreements that we've negotiated over the years and say, fellas, we'll take the same deal we gave you. And they'll gridlock right at that point because, for example, we've got international competitors who simply could not unload their cars off the ships if they had to comply. You see, if it was a two-way street, just couldn't do it. Pretty simple. If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, have no health care, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
Unfortunately, some will continue to feel that such a candidate will split the Republican vote and assure a victory for the Democrats. Well, even if this happens, so what? Fed-up Americans and Tea Party activists will continue to be voted into the House and the Senate, as has been happening for the past 2 years. This will create a gridlock between Congress and the President. Thus, even if a Democrat does get into the White House, he will not be effective. He will not be able to implement any more socialist programs. So again, what does it matter who of the entrenched are in the White House? It will be impossible for an independent candidate to be a spoiler, because there will be nothing to spoil.
I believe that if another political party were formed based on the same structure as the existing 2 major political parties, or even the existing alternative political parties, there would be nothing to prevent it in time from being corrupted by the influx of people who want to steer it in another direction, or the people with a lot of money who could literally take it over through financial influence. But what could prevent it is if the new political party were to have a constitution or a bylaw which would state very firmly that this party stood for certain principles now and forever, not subject to change, but now and forever. And if you don't like this, then go somewhere else. This is what we believe in. Ultimately, I don't think we should have political parties at all. I think they're anathema to our system, to our republic. But for now, we've got the real world to live in. I would say, let's create a political party with firm political principles.
The American people are fed up with big, demopublican government, its amassing of endless debt, its confiscation of middle-class wealth, its refusal to check the invasion of illegal immigrants, and its perpetual entanglements in foreign affairs.
Oh yeah, look at that, right through the windshield.
With 38% of the vote going to a third-party candidate, 62% would be left to split between the Democrats and Republicans, the former getting about 36% and the latter getting about 26%. This would be a clear-cut victory for the independent candidate, something that has happened before in our nation's history and something that can happen again. So, would a third party really be a spoiler? Not at all. Let's put that discouraging myth to bed.
The system here is very biased, and I think that I encourage everybody to do what they want on third parties and encourage them, and maybe someday the rules will get better.
A third party could win. A third party would bring much-needed reform, rock the nation, make some history. But most importantly, it would stop the runaway freight train of government growth, a growth that will destroy our great republic unless we find our way back to the principles set forth in the U.S. Constitution.